These three words can change. When God moves in your life, nothing is wrong with your faith. But something is about to change. If you believe in God, pray, trust Jesus, and still feel overwhelmed by anxiety, silence, or a sense of delay, this moment will hit closer than you expect. You're not disconnected, you're not failing. You're simply stuck in that quiet space where life feels paused and answers don't come. Here's what most people never notice. In Scripture, God doesn't move when people push harder or panic in prayer. He moves when a subtle internal shift happens first, something so quiet it's easy to miss. And that shift is always marked by three simple words that change timing, not circumstances. If prayer feels silent and peace feels distant, stay with me. What you're about to hear may completely change how you understand when God moves in your life. The moment before, God interrupts everything. There is a moment in life that feels strangely uneventful, almost disappointing, and yet it carries more weight than the breakthrough itself. It is the moment when nothing appears to be happening, when prayers are still spoken but expectations begin to soften, when effort no longer feels urgent and hope becomes quieter. Most people overlook this moment because it does not look spiritual, powerful, or meaningful. But in the rhythm of Scripture, this is often where God positions himself to act. This moment usually arrives after exhaustion, not failure. You have done what you knew to do. You believed, waited, trusted, and stayed faithful even without reassurance. And then something shifts, not in circumstances, but in how tightly you are holding the outcome. You stop demanding clarity. You stop bargaining with timing. You stop trying to interpret every silence as a message. That internal release is rarely celebrated, yet it is deeply significant. In the Bible, God often moves when people reach a point where faith is no longer fueled by urgency, but by surrender. Abraham did not receive the promise while counting days, but when he learned to walk without timelines. Moses encountered God not while chasing purpose, but while tending sheep in obscurity. Hannah's breakthrough did not begin with louder prayer, but with a moment of inner quiet, where striving gave way to trust. These moments look passive from the outside, but they are deeply active within. What makes this stage uncomfortable is that it feels like loss of momentum. You wonder if your desire is fading or if your faith is weakening. In reality, something healthier is forming. Faith is detaching from control. Trust is no longer dependent on emotional certainty. Hope stops asking for signs and starts resting in God's character. That internal shift is often the final preparation before movement. Many people mistake this moment for spiritual stagnation and rush to escape it. They distract themselves, lower expectations, or move ahead without direction. Others interpret it as rejection and quietly give up. But Scripture shows that this moment is rarely abandonment. It is alignment. God is not withholding action. He is refining readiness. There is a reason God often acts after silence. Silence strips faith of performance. It exposes motive. It reveals whether trust exists without immediate reward. When the noise fades, what remains is the true posture of the heart. That posture matters more than intensity, discipline, or words. If your life feels paused right now, it does not mean you missed something. It may mean you arrived at the threshold where God no longer needs to correct behavior, but simply waits for your heart to settle into trust without pressure. This is the moment before interruption, before redirection, before acceleration. It is quiet because it is precise. God rarely interrupts chaos. He interrupts clarity. He moves when striving gives way to stillness, when expectation releases control, and when faith learns to wait without anxiety. That is why this moment feels subtle, almost invisible. And that is why it changes everything. Why spiritual effort sometimes delays divine action? There is a hard truth that many believers struggle to accept. Sometimes the very effort meant to move God closer is what delays the moment He acts. This does not mean effort is wrong or that prayer is ineffective. It means that not all effort is aligned, and not all spiritual activity creates readiness. In Scripture, God often waits not for more action, but for the right posture behind it. Spiritual effort becomes a problem when it is driven by anxiety rather than trust. You pray, not because you are at peace with God, but because you are afraid of what will happen if He does not respond quickly. You seek signs, confirmations, and reassurance, not to deepen relationship, but to reduce uncertainty. Over time, faith turns into pressure, and prayer turns into negotiation. That pressure is felt internally, even if it looks faithful on the outside. The Bible shows that God does not respond to urgency the way humans do. Urgency pushes. God responds to alignment. When effort is fueled by fear of delay, it creates noise that masks what God is already doing quietly. People assume God is slow when in reality they are spiritually overactive, unable to recognize stillness as part of movement. Many biblical figures learned this lesson painfully. The Israelites cried out for deliverance, but wandered longer because impatience shaped their response. King Saul lost favor not because he failed to act, but because he acted too quickly when silence tested him. Martha tried to serve Jesus actively while missing the moment of presence that Mary recognized. In each case, effort was visible, but alignment was absent. Spiritual effort delays divine action when it tries to control timing. God is not moved by intensity alone. He is not impressed by exhaustion or repetition. He moves when effort flows from trust, not from fear of missing out on His plan. When the heart relaxes, perception sharpens. When striving quiets, discernment increases. This is why some prayers feel unanswered, even though they are sincere. It is not rejection, it is refinement. God allows effort to reach its limit so that dependence can replace pressure. He waits until prayer becomes communion again, not a transaction. Until faith stops asking when and starts trusting who. There is a moment when effort shifts from pushing God to listening for Him. That moment often feels like giving up, but it is actually growing up spiritually. You stop trying to provoke movement and start recognizing presence. That is when timing changes. If you feel tired from trying to make something happen, that exhaustion may not be a setback. It may be the point where God is waiting for effort to release control so that alignment can take its place. When that happens, divine action no longer feels delayed. It feels inevitable. The inner posture God responds to. There is a posture of the heart that God responds to consistently, and it has very little to do with how religious a person appears. It is not perfection, confidence, or emotional strength. It is not certainty, clarity, or even bold faith. It is something quieter, something less visible, and far more difficult to fake. Scripture reveals again and again that God moves when the heart reaches a place of honest alignment rather than controlled belief. This posture forms when a person stops managing God and starts trusting Him without leverage. It is the moment when faith no longer needs guarantees to remain faithful. You still desire answers, but you are no longer demanding them on your terms. You still hope for movement, but you are no longer threatening your peace if it does not come immediately. That shift is subtle, yet it changes everything. God responds to hearts that are open without being desperate, surrendered without being passive, and trusting without being naive. This posture is not weakness. It is spiritual maturity. It recognizes that God is not an idea to be activated, but a presence to be honored. When the heart reaches this place, prayer becomes conversation again, not persuasion. In Scripture, this posture often appears after disappointment. Jacob wrestled until his strength was gone, then walked differently. Job stopped demanding explanations and encountered God in a way arguments never produced. Mary accepted a calling she did not fully understand, without asking for proof that suffering would be avoided. In each case, God moved not when emotions settled, but when the heart stopped resisting uncertainty. What blocks this posture is the need to feel safe before trusting. Many believers unknowingly condition their faith on reassurance. They say they trust God, but only if they can understand what He is doing. That is not trust. That is control dressed as belief. God often withholds clarity until the heart is willing to remain faithful without it. The inner posture God responds to is willing to wait without resentment, obey without visibility, and remain open without guarantees. It does not suppress questions, but it releases entitlement to answers. It does not deny desire, but it refuses to let desire dictate obedience. When this posture forms, something changes internally. Fear loses authority. Anxiety no longer interprets silence as danger. Peace becomes independent of outcomes. That internal stability signals readiness, not readiness for comfort, but readiness for movement without collapse. God trusts this posture because it can carry blessing without breaking. He moves when the heart can receive without idolizing, progress without pride, and delay without despair. That is why timing shifts when posture changes. If you sense that something inside you is settling, not because circumstances improved, but because your grip has loosened, pay attention. That may be the exact posture God has been waiting for. And once it forms, movement is no longer forced. It is released. When silence becomes a signal instead of an absence. Silence is one of the most misunderstood experiences in the spiritual life. Many people interpret it as distance, disapproval, or abandonment. When prayers are met with quiet, the mind rushes to fill the gap with fear, doubt, or self-blame. But in Scripture, silence is rarely empty. More often, it is deliberate. It is not the absence of God, but a different form of His communication. God's silence often arrives when words would interfere with formation. When answers come too early, they can create dependence instead of discernment. When direction is given too quickly, it can produce obedience without maturity. Silence forces the heart to slow down, to listen beyond language, to confront motives that noise would conceal. That is why silence feels uncomfortable. It removes distraction and exposes what is actually driving faith. Throughout the Bible, some of the most significant movements of God are preceded by long periods of quiet. Joseph spent years without explanation before purpose unfolded. David endured seasons where God said nothing while Saul pursued him relentlessly. Jesus himself lived 30 years in obscurity before a public word was spoken over his life. Silence was not punishment, it was preparation. The danger of silence is not what God is doing, but how we interpret it. When silence is seen as rejection, people rush ahead. They fill the gap with substitutes. They lower expectations, compromise direction, or seek certainty from places that offer quick relief but shallow peace. Silence becomes threatening only when it is misunderstood. When silence is recognized as a signal, everything changes. It signals that God is working beneath the surface, shaping discernment rather than circumstances. It signals that dependence on external reassurance is being replaced by internal stability. It signals that faith is being invited to mature beyond emotional feedback. Silence teaches the heart to trust presence without proof. It strips prayer of urgency and returns it to relationship. It reveals whether faith exists for God Himself or for the outcomes He provides. This is why silence often comes when a person is close to transition. Noise would distract. Explanation would interfere. Only stillness can refine what needs to be strengthened. There is a moment when silence stops feeling threatening and starts feeling intentional. When that happens, anxiety loses its grip. You no longer measure God's nearness by response time. You sense that something is being aligned, even if nothing is being explained. That awareness is not resignation, it is clarity. If God has been quiet in your life, do not rush to escape it. Ask what is being formed in you that noise would prevent. Silence does not mean God has stepped back. It often means He is closer than before, working in a way that words cannot accomplish. The 3 words that appear right before movement. There is a pattern in Scripture that is easy to miss because it does not announce itself. It does not arrive with thunder, urgency, or dramatic signs. It appears quietly, often in passing, right before God intervenes in a life, a situation, or a moment of history. These 3 words are simple, ordinary, and rarely emphasized, yet they consistently mark the shift from waiting to movement. What makes these words powerful is not how they sound, but what they reveal. They do not describe action yet. They describe readiness. They show that something has already changed internally before anything changes externally. God does not use these words to signal effort, urgency, or desperation. He uses them to mark alignment. In Scripture, divine movement is almost never random. God does not act impulsively or react emotionally. He responds to moments when the heart, the timing, and the purpose intersect. These three words quietly announce that intersection. They appear when a person has stopped striving, stopped demanding clarity, and stopped trying to control outcomes. They signal that the internal resistance has softened. What is striking is that these words often appear after silence, not before. They come after confusion, after disappointment, after long seasons of waiting. They are not spoken when faith feels strong, but when it has become steady. They do not follow emotional highs, but emotional settling. That is why they are easy to overlook. Many people search Scripture for promises and commands, but miss these markers of timing. They focus on what God will do and forget to observe when He chooses to do it. These three words quietly tell you that something has shifted in the spiritual atmosphere, not because circumstances changed, but because readiness has formed. When these words appear, God is not being persuaded to move. He is responding to alignment that already exists. The heart is no longer divided between trust and control. The mind is no longer racing ahead of faith. The soul is no longer bargaining with outcomes. That internal stillness creates space for divine action. This is why these words change timing rather than circumstances. Circumstances often remain unchanged for a moment, even after they appear. What changes immediately is direction. Momentum begins invisibly. What felt delayed starts to feel precise. What felt confusing starts to make sense later, not now. People often assume that God moves when pressure reaches a peak. Scripture shows something different. God moves when pressure releases its grip, when expectation stops demanding, when fear stops interpreting silence, when faith stops asking for signs. That release is subtle, but it is decisive. These three words are not magic. They are not formulas to be repeated. They are indicators that the heart has reached a place God can trust with movement. They tell you that timing has shifted, even if evidence has not appeared yet. If your life feels quiet but settled, if your prayers feel honest but unforced, if your waiting feels different than before, pay attention. You may be standing in the space these words describe. And when they appear in Scripture, movement always follows. Why these words change timing, not circumstances. One of the greatest misunderstandings about divine movement is the assumption that when God acts, circumstances must immediately shift. Doors should open. Problems should resolve. Tension should disappear. But Scripture consistently shows that when God begins to move, the first thing that changes is not what surrounds you, but when things unfold. Timing adjusts long before outcomes appear. These three words do not announce visible transformation. They announce precision. They mark the moment when events are no longer random, delayed, or drifting, but ordered. God is not rushing to alter conditions. He is aligning sequence. What comes next matters as much as what comes later, and premature change would damage what is being prepared. Timing in the biblical sense is not about speed. It is about fitness. It answers the question of whether the heart can sustain what is coming without losing discernment, humility, or dependence. That is why God often leaves circumstances untouched for a season, even after readiness is reached. Movement has begun, but it is internal, directional, and intentional. When timing changes, perception sharpens. You begin to notice restraint where you once felt pressure. You sense boundaries where you once felt confusion. Decisions that felt urgent lose their urgency. Options that once tempted you lose their appeal. Nothing has changed externally, yet something is clearly different. That is timing at work. Scripture shows this pattern repeatedly. Israel was delivered from Egypt, but the wilderness remained. David was anointed king, but Saul stayed on the throne. Joseph was remembered but remained in prison for a time. In each case, timing shifted before circumstances followed. God was not slow. He was sequencing. Circumstances change when they can no longer disrupt formation. If God alters the environment too soon, the heart may depend on relief rather than trust. If He removes pressure prematurely, growth may reverse. Timing protects transformation. It ensures that what God gives does not undo what He has built. This is why these words are so important. They tell you that delay is no longer arbitrary. Silence is no longer empty. Waiting is no longer wasted. Timing has moved from preparation to intention. Even if nothing looks different, everything is now ordered toward purpose. People often misinterpret this phase and become discouraged. They expect visible confirmation and feel disappointed when it does not arrive. But Scripture teaches that when God shifts timing, the next steps are inevitable, not immediate. Momentum exists, even if evidence does not. This phase requires trust without reinforcement. It asks the heart to remain steady without applause or clarity. That is why many people fall back into anxiety here. They sense change but cannot see it, and uncertainty returns. But this is where maturity holds the line. When timing changes, God is no longer deciding whether to act. He is deciding how. The outcome is settled. The process is protected. This is why peace often returns before answers do. Peace is the signal that timing has aligned. If you are in a season where nothing has changed, yet everything feels quieter, slower, and more deliberate, do not rush to interpret that as stagnation. It may be the clearest sign that timing has shifted and movement is already underway. The emotional shift that triggers spiritual acceleration. There is an emotional shift that often goes unnoticed, yet it plays a decisive role in when God moves. It is not happiness. It is not relief. It is not confidence. It is the moment when emotional pressure loosens its grip and urgency quietly fades. This shift does not mean desire disappears. It means desire is no longer in control. Before this shift, emotions tend to lead faith. Anxiety interprets silence. Fear rushes decisions. Hope rises and falls based on signs. Prayer becomes reactive, shaped by emotional weather rather than grounded trust. God does not condemn this stage, but He rarely accelerates movement within it. Emotional instability makes timing fragile. Spiritual acceleration begins when emotions stop demanding immediate resolution, when fear no longer dictates urgency, when disappointment no longer interprets delay as denial, when hope becomes steady instead of volatile. This emotional settling creates internal capacity. It allows the heart to carry movement without panic. In Scripture, God often moves after this emotional realignment occurs. Elijah encountered God not in fire or earthquake, but after emotional exhaustion gave way to quiet awareness. Peter was restored not when his confidence returned, but when his defensiveness dissolved. The disciples recognized Jesus after resurrection not through excitement, but through calm recognition. Emotion no longer clouded perception. This shift does not feel dramatic. It often feels like emotional sobriety. You still care, but you are no longer frantic. You still wait, but you are no longer restless. You still pray, but without pressure. That calm is not apathy. It is clarity. God accelerates movement when emotions stop pulling faith in multiple directions. Acceleration does not mean speed. It means momentum without resistance. When emotions settle, obedience becomes simpler. Discernment becomes sharper. Peace becomes stable. God trusts this state because it does not collapse under uncertainty. Many people fear this emotional shift because they mistake it for losing passion. They think if urgency fades, faith is weakening. Scripture shows the opposite. When emotional intensity decreases, spiritual stability increases. Faith becomes less reactive and more resilient. This is why some people feel strangely calm right before change. The chaos lifts before the breakthrough appears. Anxiety releases before circumstances shift. That calm is not accidental. It is the emotional condition that allows acceleration without distortion. God does not move faster when emotions are loud. He moves cleaner when emotions are aligned. Emotional clarity removes friction from timing. It allows God to act without having to repair damage caused by panic or haste. If you notice that something you once obsessed over no longer controls your thoughts, pay attention. If fear that once dominated your prayers has quieted, notice it. That emotional shift may be the clearest indicator that movement is approaching. When emotions stop demanding answers, faith becomes ready to receive direction. That is when spiritual acceleration begins. Quietly, precisely without noise. And once it starts, it does not need to announce itself. It simply unfolds. Recognizing God's movement while nothing looks different. One of the most difficult skills in the spiritual life is learning to recognize movement when nothing on the surface has changed. Most people associate God's action with visible results, open doors, clear answers, or dramatic reversals. But Scripture reveals that God often moves long before evidence appears. If movement only counted when circumstances shifted, much of God's work would go unnoticed. This stage is confusing because the external world offers no confirmation. Your situation looks the same. The problem still exists. The waiting continues. And yet, internally, something feels different. Not better in a shallow sense, but steadier. The urgency has softened. The questions feel quieter. The pressure to resolve everything immediately has lifted. That internal change is not imagination. It is discernment beginning to awaken. God's movement often starts with restraint rather than action. He begins by removing false options, closing emotional exits, and narrowing focus. You stop feeling pulled in multiple directions. Certain choices lose their appeal. Some distractions no longer satisfy. You may not know what is next, but you know what is no longer right. That narrowing is movement. In Scripture, God frequently moves this way. Before Abraham ever left, his attachment shifted. Before the Red Sea parted, Israel was told to stand still. Before Lazarus walked out, Jesus waited. Movement began before action. Alignment came before outcome. God was already working, even though nothing looked different yet. This is where many people lose confidence. They expect confirmation through change and feel disappointed when it does not arrive. But God does not confirm His movement through speed. He confirms it through clarity. When confusion decreases, when reaction slows, when peace becomes less fragile, movement is underway. Recognizing this requires patience and honesty. You must resist the urge to measure progress by visible improvement. Instead, you learn to ask different questions. Are you less reactive than before? Are you more discerning about what matters? Are you more anchored in trust than urgency? These are signs of movement that circumstances cannot show. God often delays visible change to protect internal transformation. If the environment shifts too soon, it can pull the heart back into dependence on outcomes. But when the heart stabilizes first, external change no longer controls identity or faith. That stability is essential. This stage also teaches humility. You cannot announce it. You cannot explain it clearly to others. It does not look impressive. It looks ordinary. Yet it is deeply intentional. God is teaching you to recognize His work without spectacle, to trust presence without proof. When you learn to recognize movement this way, waiting becomes different. It is no longer empty time. It becomes attentive time. You are not passive, you are aware. You are not forcing progress. You are watching alignment take shape. If you are in a season where nothing has changed outwardly, but everything feels less chaotic inwardly, do not dismiss that. That quiet clarity may be the clearest evidence that God is already moving, just not in the way you expected. What changes after God moves once? There is a subtle but permanent change that takes place after God moves, even if the circumstances that prompted your prayers are still unfolding. This change is not always visible to others, and it is not measured by immediate results. It happens internally, reshaping how you relate to God, to waiting, and to uncertainty. Once God moves, even quietly, you are never positioned the same way again. The first thing that changes is perception. You stop interpreting every delay as danger and every silence as rejection. Faith becomes less reactive and more grounded. You no longer search constantly for signs because you have learned to recognize God's presence without them. This does not eliminate questions, but it removes the panic behind them. Trust also changes form. Before, trust may have depended on reassurance, progress, or emotional confirmation. After God moves, trust becomes steadier and less conditional. You no longer need God to explain himself in order to follow him. Obedience becomes simpler because it is no longer fueled by fear of missing out, but by confidence in who God is. Another shift happens in how you wait. Waiting no longer feels like wasted time or suspended life. It becomes part of movement itself. You understand that waiting is not inactivity, but formation. This awareness protects you from rushing ahead or settling too early. You learn that timing is not something to fight, but something to respect. Your relationship with control also changes. After God moves, you recognize how much energy was spent trying to manage outcomes. That realization creates humility, not shame. You begin to release control more quickly, not because you are passive, but because you have seen that God is trustworthy beyond your understanding. This makes future seasons of waiting less destabilizing. God's movement also sharpens discernment. You become more sensitive to misalignment, to distractions, to choices that look appealing but carry unrest. You no longer need dramatic warnings. Subtle unease is enough to redirect you. That discernment is one of the quiet gifts that comes after movement. What changes most is confidence, not in yourself, but in God's faithfulness across time. You stop measuring God by single outcomes and start recognizing patterns of care, protection, and preparation. Even unanswered prayers are no longer evidence against him. They become part of a larger story you trust him to write. This internal transformation is why God often delays visible results. He is not just solving a problem. He is reshaping how you live, decide, and believe. Once that change occurs, future challenges do not destabilize you the same way. You carry memory of movement, not just hope for it. If you sense that your faith feels quieter but stronger, less dramatic but more resilient, that may be the sign that God has already moved in you. And once that movement happens, your life is no longer defined by fear of delay, but by confidence in divine timing that does not need to prove itself. If you are hearing this now, timing is already involved. There is a reason this message is reaching you at this specific moment, and it has nothing to do with chance or coincidence. In Scripture, God rarely speaks randomly. He speaks when the heart is ready to hear without resisting, when the mind is quiet enough to recognize truth, and when timing has already begun to shift beneath the surface. The fact that this resonates now is not accidental. It is indicative. Many people wait for visible change before believing God is near. But often, awareness comes before evidence. Recognition comes before results. God prepares understanding before he releases outcomes. That is why moments like this matter more than they seem. They arrive when perception is ready to change, even if circumstances are not. If you are hearing this and feeling a quiet confirmation rather than emotional excitement, that matters. If something in you feels steady instead of stirred, that matters. God does not always announce himself with intensity. Sometimes he confirms timing through calm clarity, through a sense of recognition that does not need explanation. Throughout Scripture, God speaks to people at transitional thresholds, not after everything is resolved. Samuel heard God before he understood what it meant. Mary received direction before seeing how it would unfold. The disciples were called before they were prepared. Awareness came first. Movement followed. This moment is not about urgency. It is about alignment. God is not asking you to do more, fix more, or push harder. He is inviting you to remain attentive, to stop interpreting silence as absence, to stop measuring faith by speed, to trust that when God moves, he does so with precision, not haste. What you do after hearing this matters less than how you hold it. Do not rush to conclusions. Do not force application. Let understanding settle. Let peace remain. Let timing unfold without interference. God's movement is rarely loud at the beginning. It gains clarity, not noise. If your life feels quiet right now, that does not mean nothing is happening. It may mean everything essential is being aligned. God often works deepest, where He works least visibly. He forms before He transforms. He aligns before He accelerates. This is not the end of waiting. It is the end of misunderstanding it. When you recognize that timing is involved, waiting no longer feels empty. It becomes purposeful. You stop asking when and start recognizing why. That shift alone changes how you live. If God has been silent, if progress feels slow, if answers feel delayed, do not assume distance. Assume intention. God does not waste moments like this. He uses them to prepare hearts that can carry what is coming without fear, pride, or collapse. And if this message reached you now, it may not be because God is about to move suddenly, but because He already has. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not late. Timing is already at work. You may see if you are hearing this now. Timing is already involved. There is a reason this message is intersecting with your life now, and it is not because you were searching for comfort or inspiration. In Scripture, timing is rarely explained in advance. It is recognized in hindsight. God often speaks when the heart has reached a point where truth can be received without resistance and direction can be held without panic. That is what makes this moment significant. Many people believe God moves after clarity arrives. The biblical pattern shows the opposite. God often allows clarity to emerge after alignment has already taken place. Awareness comes first, then confirmation. Understanding follows obedience, not the other way around. That is why moments like this feel quiet rather than dramatic. They are not meant to excite. They are meant to stabilize. If this resonates without emotional intensity, that matters. If it feels steady rather than overwhelming, that matters. God does not always speak through urgency or heightened feeling. Often, He confirms timing through calm recognition, through a sense of internal agreement that does not need to be argued or explained. That calm is not indifference, it is readiness. Throughout Scripture, God speaks at thresholds, not conclusions. Moses encountered God before deliverance began. Samuel heard God before understanding His voice. The disciples were called before they were formed. God does not wait for circumstances to resolve before engaging the heart. He engages the heart so that circumstances do not define faith when they change. This moment is not a command to act. It is an invitation to remain attentive. God is not asking you to push forward or retreat. He is asking you to stop misreading the season you are in. Silence is not neglect. Delay is not denial. Stillness is not stagnation. These are often signs that timing is being protected. What matters now is not what you do next, but how you carry what you have recognized. Rushing to apply can disrupt what needs to settle. Forcing meaning can interrupt formation. God often works best when understanding is allowed to mature naturally, without pressure to produce immediate change. If your life feels quieter than before, that may be intentional. God often removes noise before He releases direction. He narrows focus before He expands territory. He stabilizes identity before He introduces movement. These are not pauses, they are preparations. Waiting changes when timing is understood. It no longer feels like empty space. It becomes purposeful alignment. You stop measuring progress by visible outcomes and start recognizing internal readiness. That shift alone transforms how faith is lived, not just how it is felt. If God has been silent, assume intention, not absence. If answers feel delayed, assume precision, not indifference. God does not waste moments of awareness like this. He uses them to prepare hearts that can receive what is coming without fear, pride, or collapse. And if this message reached you now, it may not be because God is about to move in a way you can see immediately. It may be because movement has already begun where it matters most. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not late. Timing is already at work quietly, deliberately, and faithfully.